Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I want to go into a discussion of some different approaches to the Hebrew text, to Hebrew words, and also just passages in general that I don't normally go into. If you have been watching some of my other videos, if you have been familiar with some of my other content, you know that my general approach to the text is to look at the so-called plain meaning of it. Not necessarily the 100% literal way, recognizing that there are symbols, there are metaphors and such which are used within the text, which are used within the Torah text, but also recognizing that the plain meaning of it, the primary meaning of it, is something that we should pay attention to, and any other meaning should probably not be overriding it in any way. And in this video, I wanted to talk about three different ideas about approaching the text. And the first one is the use of the Paleo-Hebrew pictographs, or hieroglyphics, or prototype lettering system. And the second one I'm going to go into is the use of numerology and other similar codes. And the third one is double prophecies, or dualistic prophecies, as they may be called. And I'm just intending to give my overall outlook and opinion regarding these three approaches in general. It's not regarding a specific application of them necessarily, but it's just regarding these general ideas or these general frames of working with the text. First, I'm going to go through and briefly describe each example, and then I'm going to go back and talk about my general thoughts on these. First, with regard to the use of these pictographs. You may be aware that in the Hebrew script with the different Hebrew letters, that many of the letters are named for different objects or different animals or other things. And even in the later scripts, even with some of them today, you can still see that there is maybe some resemblance to whatever it is that the letter is named for. And if we go back far enough, there is this older Hebrew script, and there's a particular practice with this script which I've observed, wherein someone might take a particular Hebrew word and then look at it in this script in particular, and then assess what it might mean based upon the pictographic script itself. So the underlying assumption might be that each individual letter which composes a word is telling us about that word. And then that information which is derived from that, derived from the representations which are understood from each of these individual letters, whatever is derived from that may be seen as giving primary information about the word in question, and depending on personal beliefs, that may be deemed as even more relevant than the way the word is used in the actual Hebrew text, the scope of the meaning of the word illustrated by its usage in the Hebrew language. So that may be one approach to using this earlier Hebrew script. And the second approach that I want to bring up is the use of numerology. And this is used in certain rabbinic circles, it's used in certain rabbinic writings, and it's also potentially used in the famous 666 number of his name in Revelation. There are a number of ways this might be approached, and one way that I have seen is taking the individual Hebrew letters and having the number associated with that letter, and then a person might be inclined to do something with those numbers or do something with the sum associated with a particular word or with a particular phrase and so forth. And sometimes that involves looking at the numeric value of a particular word and then assigning a significance and association between that word and that numeric value, and as a byproduct of that, as an extension of that, looking at other words which also share that same sum. And there are many other ways that that might be approached. The third approach I want to describe is the use of dualistic or double prophecies. And this is a bit different from the other two, but in some ways there are some similarities. And depending on your belief system, just like with any of these other examples, this may seem a particular way, whether that be important for the purpose of certain beliefs or whether that be seen as maybe not the way that we would want to approach it. And just a brief example, I'm just going to go into the structure of it and not focus on the content, so I'm just going to make up some content. So let's just say there's a hypothetical prophecy in some part of the Hebrew text that this does not exist, but just hypothetically, if there were such a prophecy, let's just say the passage says that Joe is going to walk across the street someday in the coming winter, and then whenever he walks across the street, he's going to find 1,000 shekels or something in the street. So I'm not saying that this is an actual prophecy, this is just something I made up for the purpose of this example. And if we're looking at it with a plain meaning, it would be laid out essentially exactly as I had described it. We would assume that this person, this Joe that is being talked about, that the context probably laid out beforehand who this person was. There was an indication of that probably preceding the passage itself. And then the coming winter, we would infer that that's associated with the time this took place. So we would assume that it's going to be the winter that came after whenever this was given, so we would be assessing the time based on that context also, and the rest of it we would be likely to take as being pretty plain and specific. The way this particular example was constructed, there weren't a lot of things which could be deemed as overly metaphoric necessarily, unless we're trying to make it that way. So that would be the sort of plain meaning approach to that, in my view. And a double prophecy, or dualistic prophecy, as some might describe it, approach would be to say that, okay, we have that one meaning, and maybe that is legitimate, but also, maybe supposedly, there's another way of looking at it. And oftentimes the way that that might take place is by focusing on one single aspect of the prophecy, one single element, whether that be one verse in particular, or whether that be one half of a verse, whether that be one part of the criteria and one part of the result, or whatever the case may be. It's essentially focusing on a small portion of it and then disregarding the rest of it. And so, as I would understand it, the way a person would be looking at it is either to say that, okay, there's this plain meaning, and then also there's like a higher level meaning to it. Or it even could be, depending on the person's level of awareness of the text, the way they may just be looking at the text is to say that this other part must not be a relevant part of it, and the relevant part of it is here. Even if that means disregarding important information, like the person that this prophetic event is supposed to happen to, or the result of that event, disregarding the portions that are not relevant to whatever the goal is behind this approach, the reading that the person is extracting from it. So now I want to go into some of my thoughts on these approaches. And one thing I want to acknowledge about all of these is that personal beliefs and subjective ideas become exceedingly relevant in how these are implemented and what is derived from them. They're certainly not a completely objective tool which one could use to look at the text with. And of course, no matter how we're looking at the text, the issue of personal beliefs always comes in. It is impossible for the human mind to just separate from all this information we've got going on and these frames with which we use to look at the world. We're not just going to obliterate that. But one thing about these particular approaches is that that becomes increasingly relevant, that the practice itself essentially relies on filling in the blank. It is often fueled by seeing-only validation, by confirmation bias. Each of these approaches can result in a massive number of different conclusions, and many of them are going to be completely contradictory, and the only arbiter in those cases is going to be personal beliefs. I'm going to say one particular phrase now that is used a lot, common sense. And what I have realized about common sense is that, number one, it doesn't exist. And number two, what people call common sense is often just personal criteria and personal beliefs. And the same sort of thing goes on with a number of other words and phrases like the word obvious or obviously, and this is something which I overuse at times, that something is obvious, and the definition of obvious is whatever fits with a person's personal beliefs. In reality, that's often what it comes down to whenever we're talking about issues of Scripture. When it comes to these types of approaches like the pictograph approach, it cannot be about extracting consistent, useful, and objective pieces of information, because Some words in Hebrew are spelled identically to each other, yet they have different meanings. And I'm not referring to the broad scope of meaning around just one word, the category of meaning for one Hebrew word. I'm referring to two separate words which are spelled the same, and yet they are completely unrelated. They have different origins behind them, and they have no overlap in their meaning. There are examples like this in the Torah. If reading these symbols were really an objective tool, we would be gleaning exactly the same information about these two different words because they're spelled the same. Clearly, this cannot be the primary tool to understand the meaning if we have situations like that, which we do. A response might be that we have to take additional information into account in order to glean the proper information from the symbols. Therein is the exact issue that I am seeing. This approach requires outside information in order to seem useful. It cannot be used in a way that produces consistent output across all examples of each symbol or set of symbolic letters, because it requires the input of personal beliefs in order to produce the desired output. It's about seeing what one is inclined to see from symbols, either literal symbols like pictographs, symbols that are created through numerology, or through distorting a prophecy into the form that a person wants to be able to use. And I don't believe that most people are doing this intentionally. That is, I don't think that they are aware of what is really going on. I think it's just a byproduct of a general culture around spirituality, so to speak. And it's also understandable that a person would want to have the view that dualistic prophecies or double prophecies are a legitimate approach, a legitimate way of taking things out of context, because this is something which does go on in certain New Testament books regarding prophecies which are referenced as being fulfilled there, assuming a person has looked into those prophecies and is aware of what is going on beyond what it just says in the New Testament reference. Likewise, I wouldn't say it was exactly the same thing as divination, but the main reason I would say that is because these approaches are probably not typically used to predict the future, at least not in the way that tarot cards, for example, would be used. I would say, however, that it could easily involve exactly the same types of thinking processes. And I think there's an additional level of risk that's associated with these approaches because it can obscure what the text is saying. When it comes to something like the double prophecies, the dualistic prophecies idea, this is very clear because a lot of times the actual prophecy itself ends up just completely ignored, such as the future restoration of Israel, which is a major subject in the Tanakh. Although more importantly, it is also in the Torah, but these latter references tend to show up a lot more. They end up on encouraging wall art, they end up on the insides of churches and such, and people never realize that it's talking about something they've completely missed, because they simply don't know what they're even looking for with it, and they've been accustomed to read things in this particular way. And by pointing this out, I'm not intending to say that these three approaches are just of zero value. My intention is not to say that necessarily. I think it can be useful to acknowledge different aspects of information that we may not normally attend to. I think it can be useful to acknowledge other ways of looking at things. And also, I want to acknowledge whenever things are highly subjective, whenever tools are more likely to be used for validation of self and validation of personal beliefs, rather than being used as a thorough, careful, or painstaking effort delving into particular passages, delving into particular words, and even struggling with oneself as one is studying this because we don't necessarily know where the conclusion is going to lead us. I would expect that while these three approaches and similar approaches to them, while they may be able to add information to a person's beliefs, I also suspect that they will rarely take away beliefs, that very few of those conclusions are actually going to challenge and remove existing beliefs or remove past beliefs that are then found to be flawed as a result. And of course, I cannot speak for anyone else, but this is what I see the potential for with those practices, and I see very little potential for differentiating between a quote-unquote legitimate use of that and an illegitimate use of that. I think that serious study and serious self-evaluation in the process will often involve challenging oneself to the degree that one will eventually become uncomfortable, sometimes severely uncomfortable because of the potential consequences to either a person's actions, to what a person has done before, the potential outcome for a person's connections, and the potential outcome for a person's overall beliefs. And of course, that is just my opinion, that is just my take on things. Thanks for listening, stay focused, and be tenacious.